Welcome to the colony of New York. So, in our previous installments in the United States history series that we've been working on, we have looked at the New England colonies, Pennsylvania, and now we shall take a trip to the hustle and bustle of the colony of New York. So first, New Netherlands. So, the Dutch, the first group of Europeans to colonize what is now New York. Now, the story of Dutch colonization in New York begins with the Dutch East India Trading Company and a gentleman by the name of Henry Hudson. Now, Henry Hudson was hired by the Dutch East India Company to look for a route to Asia known as the Northwest Passage. So, a little background. When Europeans first became aware of the existence of the North and South American continents in the early modern era, they had a little bit of confusion as to exactly how big these continents were, and originally conceived of them as more of a small island, or eventually a bigger and bigger island the more they mapped it out, that sat in between Europe and Asia. So, the wisdom was that you had to be able to sail around it. Now, by this point, explorers had already managed to circumnavigate around the tip of Cape Horn in order to reach Asia by going around South America. But for countries in Northern Europe, that was a fairly lengthy trip, as you were traveling miles and miles south to go around the Horn, only to go back up north to hit the Spice Islands in China and India. And so, for the countries of Northern Europe, it would be much more convenient to go around the northern end of the continent. And so, explorers began searching for just that, a northwest passage westward around the northern part of America. Now, Mr. Hudson never did find this fabled Northwest Passage. Instead, what he sailed up turned out to be a river, which was eventually named after him, becoming the Hudson River. The Dutch eventually settled in the land around the Hudson River and found a colony which they call New Netherlands, named after the Netherlands, or Holland, which is the country where the Dutch hail from. Now, at the mouth of the Hudson, the Dutch found a city which they call New Amsterdam. This city will eventually be what we now call New York City. Now, the Dutch also found a fortified position farther up the Hudson River. And this fortress is what they name after their ruling family. They call it Fort Orange, after the House of Orange, which was the ruling dynasty of the Netherlands. Fort Orange will later go on to be Albany. So, the way the Dutch chose to divide up the land is more seigneurial, that is to say, more in line with large noble families. Think the manorial feudal system from your time in Global 9. It's more along those lines. So, for example, families like the Rentslers, like if you've heard of Rensselaer County, that whole area of land was originally granted to the Rensselaer family. And they owned that. That was their personal land. They then rented it out to tenant farmers who would work the fields and would give them either money or a share of their crops as a rent payment. This condition actually would extend long after the Dutch left there, long after the British took over, and even into a period after the United States is established. This issue of landlord rights became so tense and so tenuous that's what eventually caused Vermont to break away from New York over the issue, because New York wanted to preserve the landlord rights, and Vermont did not. Now, most of the farming is still subsistence farming. It's farming for food. At this point, this is food that's being farmed, and most of it is used for local consumption. So, in Rensselaer County, what they were farming was being farmed either for consumption by the Rensselaers or other people within Rensselaer County. A very small amount of it might be shipped to other colonies, but for the most part, the food was for local consumption. Now, the English invade. So eventually the English fleet show up, and they aim to take the city of New Amsterdam. Now, the Dutch had soldiers, and they could have fought. However, the citizens of New Amsterdam pretty much ordered the governor to surrender rather than see the city destroyed by the English. And as a result of this, the English end up conquering the rest of New Netherlands bloodlessly due to the governor's surrender. With the fall of that particular governor, both the city of New Amsterdam and the entire territory of New Netherlands is renamed New York after the Duke of York, who was a relative of the king. Now, New York. So, under the reign of the British, the noble Dutch families retained their land rights. So families like the Rensselaers still held control over Rensselaer County and places like that throughout the British reign. This caused an intense class divide between those who held land under the old seigneurial rights and those who did not. Class tensions were high in New York, and this also plays a large role in the revolutionary struggle that follows, as many people would side one way or another in the Revolutionary War based on their positions in the class divide within New York State. Now, subsistence agriculture also continued. What was grown in New York was often used mostly just to feed New York, and occasionally some of it might be shipped southward to feed the southern colonies who were growing cash crops for Britain. Now, New York City became a major trading hub similar to Boston, within the triangle trade and areas of that nature. So, sugar cane from the Caribbean would be brought up. Many times slaves would be brought into harbors like New York and Boston. At this point, slavery is still legal in New York, so there was some degree of slave trading in New York. Not quite what it would have been down in, say, Virginia or the Carolinas, but that was still an industry. British manufactured goods would often come into the port of New York, etc. So that so far has been New York. In our next installment, we'll be taking a look at the South.